Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome. I've always been a fan of 17th century Dutch painting myself. How many of you have been in the Netherlands? The Netherlands. Well, two out of four. That's all right. That's getting better. Anyway, okay, that's just by way of introduction. That's a book I had when I was a child. Okay, okay. So, French travel poster, railroad poster. Okay, now the history of the Netherlands, long and convoluted, of course, but for a long time they belonged to Spain. And in the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation came along, the Dutch became ultimately Dutch Reformed, and Spain didn't like that, and there was an 80-year war of independence, not continual, but it took until 1648 before the Netherlands was officially an independent country and free of Spain. But already by 1609, they were pretty much independent, and they had entered into their golden age. Now, the country was very prosperous. They had a very strong navy, which would come into conflict with the English navy in the second half of the century. They were also building an overseas empire, and you've probably all heard of the Dutch East India Company, trading for spices in Indonesia and in East Asia. As a result, the middle class was now rising, and these people had money. And everybody wanted to buy paintings all of a sudden. Everybody, of course, wanted to do what the aristocrats had traditionally done. Peter Mundy, who was an English traveler, was traveling in the Netherlands in 1640, and he wrote in his daybook, "As for the art of painting and the affection of the people to pictures, I think none other go beyond them. All in general striving to adorn their houses, especially the outer or street room, with costly pieces. Butchers and bakers, not much inferior in their shops, which are fairly set forth. Yea, many times blacksmiths, cobblers, etc., will have some picture or other by their forge and in their stalls." So you can imagine how popular painting was. Now, those of you who have been in the Netherlands will no doubt remember these types of houses. Paintings, if you look at Dutch 17th century paintings, most of them are rather small, because they had to be able to fit into the houses. The houses were quite tall, with many stories instead of being wide. That was so they could save money, because buildings were taxed according to the amount of ground they took up. So people built up. And if you look up at the top, let's see, maybe this will, can I get is there a little arrow anywhere on there? Okay, right there. You see the like a beam coming out. There's a hook on the end of that, and then when they had furniture, they would have to hoist the furniture up and push it in through the windows because the staircases were too narrow. So there also, the art patronage was changing. It was up to the middle class to buy paintings. Since the church had no power in Protestant Holland, there was no patronage from the church. Nobles and the royal family didn't seem to take much interest in the arts. So for the first time in history, artists were actually thrown on the open market the way they are today. And they would simply paint whatever they painted best and hope for customers. Now, this free art market would end up costing real difficulties for numerous artists, including the three greatest masters of the century in Holland, Hals, Vermeer, and Rembrandt. All three of them ran into problems with money. So in the paintings of 17th century Holland, we don't have any visions or ecstasies of saints. There's no images of royal power, and there are no historical allegories. Whenever they did paint mythological scenes or biblical scenes, which was relatively rare, they looked like everyday life. And it's also very rare to see the economic means of production depicted. They were, however, the heirs to the natural vision of Netherlandish painting, which is what we refer to it by the 15th, 16th century, when the countries didn't have the same borders that they do today. So Netherlandish means from the Low Countries. And they had already developed an expertise. It was optical expertise. It was a Dutchman who first invented the telescope in, if I'm correct, 1608. Galileo simply improved it. It was also a Dutchman, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope. Now, beyond that, much of Holland, as you saw in that thing at the beginning, is actually land that originally was in the seabed, which means there is lots of silica in the soil of Holland. Now, where in the human body do you have silica? In the eye. Little grains like sand that help to reflect the light. So that in a way we can say Holland is the eye of the world. Now, have most of you heard of Caravaggio? Yes. Okay, Italian painter who started producing these scenes with amazing chiaroscuro, contrasts of dark and light in order to bring out the Baroque drama of the scene. There was a strong influence of Caravaggio on Dutch art by way of a number of Dutch artists from Utrecht who had actually traveled to Italy in the early 17th century. But none of the Dutch Caravaggists will have the same intensity as Caravaggio himself. Now, here's one to begin with. Hendrik ter Brugghen. He was in Rome between 1604 and 1614, so it's quite possible that he actually had met Caravaggio himself. And he was the first Dutch Caravaggist to return to Holland. Now, he was also quite inspired, but he remained something of an outsider, and he died in his early 40s. Now, if you notice, this painting has a poetic mood and delicacy. He was the first painter to explore a device of a dark-shadowed figure against a light background. And the fife player actually appears to be in theatrical costume. Now, the Flemish painter, Peter Paul Rubens, who was also 17th century, was traveling through Holland in 1627, in which he wrote, "Traveling throughout the Netherlands and looking for a painter, he had found but one, namely Hendrikus ter Brugghen." And here, another one with dramatic lighting by Gerrit van Honthorst. Dutch is not an easy language to pronounce. Van Honthorst was the best known and the most successful of all of the Dutch Caravaggists because he also painted for English, Bohemian, Flemish, Dutch, and French royalty. Now, he's said to have been in Rome from 1610 to 1612, although we have no documentation on that. But he was definitely documented in Rome between 1616 and 1620. Caravaggio was already dead by then. But unlike Caravaggio, he preferred scenes that were illuminated by artificial light. The light source, as here, often being hidden in his paintings. And he popularized this trend in Dutch painting. Consequently, he's also famous for his night scenes. Now, the supper party was painted during his last months in Italy. He's known for his scenes of joyful, light-hearted gatherings. And Utrecht artists also had a tendency to favor the erotic, because it's quite possible that this painting is actually a scene in a brothel. There are two light sources, and they cast this warm golden glow on the reds, the blues, and the yellows. And the open light on the right reveals a young girl putting a piece of chicken into a man's mouth, while an old woman enjoys the scene. Notice that very careful study of the reflections of light on the wrinkles on her face. One man holds a glass and bottle. He's ready for another draft. And the hidden light source over on the left emphasizes the expressions of joy and interest. The foremost figure, the one right here in the front, who covers the light, that is what would be referred to as a repoussoir device in painting. It means to push back in French. When you have a repoussoir device, it means you have somebody who seems to be projecting right into your space. And consequently, it acts like a bridge so that we can cross over the picture plane into the space on the other side. And Through Dutch Caravaggiosts, the influence of Caravaggio would be strongly apparent in the work of all three of the greatest masters of Holland in that century, Hals, Vermeer, and Rembrandt. And here we have a painting by Frans Hals. Willem Kooijmans. The way you pronounce a W in Dutch is it's like there's a V in front of the W. V. So that's Willem. Yeah. One of the greatest portraitists in the history of Western art. Now, portraiture was in high demand in Holland because you had a rising middle class and they wanted to see themselves depicted. And so he's making use of that same kind of what we could call tenebrist lighting, the dark where you have the contrasts of dark and light. This is not the traditional mask that you would see in formal portraiture. Hals has that unique quality of being able to catch an individual in the moment with an acute sense of psychological perception. So we see a strong characterization and an intimate confrontation with the sitter. Kooijman appears downright insolent. You notice how he has one eyebrow cocked, has kind of a smug expression on his face, and has his hat set at a jaunty angle. Look at his elbow. The right elbow is a repoussoir device. You see how it projects right into our space and enables us to cross over. Now, Hals was one of the greatest virtuosi of the brush in the history of art. He uses these dashing, sketch-like brushstrokes that give this strong illusion of life and a sense of immediacy. His paintings tend to look as if they were done right on the spot, as if he were doing a sketch with a paintbrush, or as if he's using the brush like a pencil. And that animating sparkle that you see comes from highlights that he would add as a final touch, and which Hals himself referred to as putting in his handwriting. Now I'm going to skip over these next two, in which I was just comparing his painting to other people of the century. And we'll go on to this painting, The Merry Drinker, sometimes called the Merry Toper. Now, in Hals's hands, now this is what you would call a genre piece, a scene from everyday life. But in the hands of Frans Hals, genre scenes became like a kind of portraiture, but freer and bolder and were more revealing of character than many commissioned portraits of the day actually had. He gives an explosive vitality to his genre subjects, and he usually selects moments when the joy of life is at its height, and the figure relates to the spectator or some person outside the picture by glance and gesture in order to heighten the illusion of a moment. The brushwork, in fact, is starting to anticipate French Impressionism. And you have this silvery, clear daylight that shivers over and animates the surfaces. And the form and texture, however, are never actually lost, but actually gain light. Now, if you look at this detail, you can see that he uses sharp, broken, and angular strokes of paint that finally resolve themselves into a coherent impression at a certain distance. And these seemingly spontaneous angular strokes tend to break up the planes and blur their edges, which creates a sense of continuity and pictorial movement and vibration. Seymour Slive, who wrote an outstanding book on Dutch painting, said, "It is Hals's revolutionary way of painting that gives his pictures a pictorial animation which makes almost all previous painting appear frozen and lifeless." Anyone familiar with that painting? Mala Baba. Now this is actually an actual person and is a genre painting at the same time. Mala means crazy. Yes. The woman was a known character in the city of Haarlem and was sometimes called the Witch of Haarlem. She suffered from mental illness and, judging from the size of that tankard, probably from alcoholism as well. In fact, she was a resident of a local hospital that served people who were either dangerous to themselves or to society, and due to physical or mental illness. Rather ironically, a son of Franz Hals wound up in that same institution years later. Now, interestingly, and in the 18th century, somebody had done an engraving of this painting and in which the name Baba became Babel. Probably he thought, well, she looks like she's about to have a collapse like the Tower of Babel. Notice the owl on her shoulder. Now that could have various meanings. First of all, she was known as the Witch of Harlem, and owls are associated with witches and prefer darkness to the light. In other words, you could see this as being the dark forces of evil that are possessing the woman, or you might say her mind is shrouded in darkness. There's also a common expression in Dutch, as drunk as an owl. Notice those quick strokes of white on the cap, the collar, and the apron ties. Another well-known painting by Hals, The Laughing Cavalier. Now that was a commissioned portrait, but he could also achieve the same sense of immediacy in something like that. The name in English is a bit of a misnomer. The man's not actually laughing. He has kind of an enigmatic smile on his face, which is very much emphasized by that upturned mustache. We don't actually know the subject's name, but it's entirely possible that he wasn't an officer at all, simply a wealthy civilian who had himself depicted like that. He's wearing a black jerkin, which is richly ornamented with orange, red, and yellow, with white lace at the collar and wrists. And there's embroidery on the costume, which displays lover's knots, bees, which were symbolic because they sting like Cupid's arrows, as well as symbols of Mercury. And no matter where you are in the room, his eyes will seem to follow you. Now here is a group portrait, the archers of the Civic Guard Company of St. Adrian. Now, there were lots and lots of civic guard companies. It's kind of like that English television show Dad's Army during the Second World War, when older men would have units at home and things like that. And these civic guard companies were ostensibly there for civil defense, but in times of peace, they pretty much functioned like men's fraternal orders. And they were organized like a guild, because they would have a patron saint and they would have an altar in the local church. On the saints' days, they would meet in their dress uniforms and have grand banquets. And some of these banquets could actually last for an entire week. In fact, in 1621, the city of Haarlem finally passed an ordinance that limited the celebrations to, quote, 3 or at the most 4 days. Because the municipality had to pay the costs, and hostilities with Spain were occasionally resumed. Now, this is an amazing group portrait. If you ever walk into the Historical Museum of Amsterdam, in one hallway, they have a number of these civic guard companies that were portrayed by a variety of artists. And as somebody once said, the earlier group portraits resemble nothing so much as so many jugs on a shelf. But here, Hals has provided this dramatic solution. Each man is an individual with a distinct personality and physiognomy. Some of the men look directly at us, others look at each other or away, some seem stern, some seem animated. And when you look at the poses, the glances, the gestures, the ruffs, the banners, etc., you have all of these lines going in different directions that balance out. This was painted when Hals was in his early 80s. Had a sure hand right into old age. These are the female governesses of a poorhouse for old men. And as you can see, he's painted the women in kind of puritanical whites, grays, and blacks. Actually, there's a lot of black worn by people in Holland in that century. And interestingly, they'd taken it from the Spanish. You notice that the women in the center are staring very shrewdly at you, the visitor. It's as if they're deciding whether or not you're worthy of charity. Now, Hals himself was absolutely destitute at times, and the painting may in fact be a very wry commentary on being in such a predicament. In 1654, the meager provisions that he owned were seized by a baker in payment for an unpaid debt for bread as well as a loan. And at one time, the city actually gave him a load of peat to burn in his fireplace so that he wouldn't freeze to death during the winter. The man ended his life in destitution, although he was never actually an inmate of the old men's home. And you notice that the women themselves in this painting almost looked like images of death.
They look like they're floating too, you know? I mean, it's like their hands are kind of floating.
You don't see the setting so closely. Right. Incidentally, that building is still there today. Today, it's the Franz Hals Museum. And that painting, as well as a painting that he did, a portrait of the male governors, are both inside. Okay, let's turn to Johannes Vermeer. Now, Vermeer was active in his native city of Delft. Now, he was another painter who had to make a living somehow or other, and so he worked as an innkeeper as well as an art dealer. And twice he was elected as an official of the Guild of St. Luke at Delft. There was an old legend that said that the evangelist Luke was also a painter and a doctor, and that he painted the Virgin Mary. And so as a result, painters' guilds in Europe were actually often dedicated to St. Luke. Now, doing all those kinds of things, he obviously had less time to paint. And in addition to that, his way of working was very slow, deliberate, and painstaking. And he died at the age of 43. And so consequently, there are less than 35 works by Vermeer in existence. The man had 15 children, but never painted a child. Gee, I wonder why. In 1672, there was an outbreak of war with France and England, in which caused a severe economic downturn, and the art market collapsed, which damaged Vermeer's business. 5 years would pass before circumstances would improve, but just 3 years into it, Vermeer himself died. His widow attributed his death to the stress of financial pressures. She still had 11 children left to raise, so the widow asked the High Court to relieve her of debts that were owed to Vermeer's creditors. And rather appropriately for a painter with such a keen and penetrating vision, the court selected as the trustee for the estate Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the man who invented the microscope. He was a surveyor for the city council of Delft. Now, the majority of his compositions are very small works. This particular painting, 18 inches high by 16 inches wide. And many of his compositions are like this. They show a single figure in an interior space that's illuminated by light from a window on the left. And his vision is so keen and so true to life that the picture surface becomes something like a clear glass window onto the interior. The title, again, is actually a misnomer. A milkmaid milks cows. This woman is a kitchen maid. Now, the woman has kind of a sturdy build, and you notice that you're also looking up at her, which gives her a sense of monumentality. She's wearing a crisp linen cap and a blue apron. Yellow and blue, by the way, were favorite color schemes of Vermeer. And she's shown very carefully pouring milk into that squat earthenware container, what would be called a Dutch oven. And that shares the table with various kinds of bread. Behind her on the floor, that object is a foot warmer. That would have contained hot coals. Because you notice the walls are whitewashed and you see the presence of milk. In other words, this room is what would be called a cool kitchen. And that's what you would use when you were working with dairy products like milk, butter, and eggs. She might very well be making bread pudding, which would account for the presence of milk and bread. Now, the bread mixed with the egg would be soaking at this moment in custard. And the maid is very carefully pouring in a trickle of milk over the top in order to cover the mixture so that the bread will simmer in the liquid while it's baking, instead of winding up as an unappetizing dry crust. Bread pudding can easily be ruined if the ingredients are not accurately measured or properly combined. Now, for at least 2 centuries before this painting was done, Dutch literature and painting depicted milkmaids and kitchen maids as being predisposed to love or sex or easily seducible. In other words, objects of male desire. And so sometimes the painters would rather unsubtly show the woman jamming a chicken onto a spit, or give the viewer, as you do here, an intimate glimpse of some kind of vessel, suggesting a uterus. Now, Vermeer has subverted the tradition. He's depicted this hardworking, modestly dressed young woman judiciously measuring ingredients as a model of domestic virtue. But he still is slyly alluding to the tradition. First of all, you have that wide-mouthed jug. And also, notice the tiles on the wall down at the bottom. That was quite common in rooms like this in a kitchen, because by putting tiles on the wall, you could mop it without getting water on the plaster. And if you look close up, wait a minute, no, back there. There we go. Okay. If you look carefully at the tiles, you'd notice one of them depicts Cupid. There's also a man carrying a pole. And foot warmers were often used by artists as symbols for female sexual arousal, because you'd place the foot warmer down near your feet, and the heat would come up under your skirt and heat your whole lower body. You're learning all kinds of things today. So is the woman concentrating, or is she faintly smiling, or is she possibly even daydreaming about a man? Vermeer certainly doesn't tell us. This painting also has one of Vermeer's most vibrant color schemes. Most painters would have used powdered azurite for the deep blue, but Vermeer always preferred the much more expensive natural ultramarine, which was made from crushed lapis lazuli, which had to be imported from Afghanistan. You also have subtle alternations of light and shadow. For example, the woman's right hand, on which the light is shining, is contrasted with the shadowed wall behind it. And the shadowed side of the maid stands out against the wall where it's illuminated. Vermeer's contemporaries would also have depicted the white walls using various forms of gray pigment. What Vermeer used was white lead, umber, and charcoal black to show the walls reflecting the daylight with different intensities. In other words, it's displaying the effects of uneven textures on plastered surfaces. Notice, for example, on the wall, the stains. There's a nail, which throws a shadow, and you see a nail hole as well. The panes of glass have been varied in very realistic ways. Now, I don't know how much of this you can actually make out, but the pane in the 4th row from the bottom on the far right has a crack in it, which is actually reflected on the wood of the window frame. There's a thin white line on the pane just below that, which would indicate a scratch. And the pane in the 2nd row from the bottom, second from the right, is pushed slightly inward in its frame. Vermeer has also captured the sparkle of reflected light in minute pearl-like dots, which you see around the contours of the objects, especially on the plated handles on the bread basket, the seeds on the crust of the bread, and the crust itself. Okay? The geographer. Now, what is the man wearing? That's a Japanese robe. They were quite popular with scholars in 17th century Holland. The Dutch were the only people from the West whom the Japanese permitted to trade with the country. think that had some problems with the Catholic Church with some of the other countries. But even so, they had to stay on an island that was just off the coast, which today I understand is a tourist site where you can see the remains of the station. Now, the details of the man's face are slightly blurred, which suggests that he's in movement. His eyes are narrowed. He's either squinting into the sunlight or doing some intense thinking. He may, in fact, be having a flash of inspiration. You see how the curtain has been drawn, and that oriental carpet on the table, those were often used as table coverings in 17th century Holland, has been pushed back. You could see both of those as being symbols of revelation. One woman wrote a book about Vermeer in which she says, he grips a book as if he's about to snatch it up to corroborate his ideas. Now, the globe that you see up on top of the chest, that was actually published in Amsterdam in 1618, and it's turned toward the Indian Ocean, where the Dutch East India Company was then active. And the decorative cartouche on the globe indicated also a plea for information for future editions, in other words, asking for revelation. On the wall, you see a sea chart, which is a chart of, quote, all the sea coasts of Europe, unquote. The chart the man is using is a nautical chart that has been printed on vellum, calfskin, the most expensive type of parchment. Now, the model for the young man might have been the source of Vermeer's sophisticated knowledge of cartographic instruments and books. It's quite probably Antony van Leeuwenhoek, because he was a man who was skilled in navigation, mathematics, philosophy, and natural science, and the two men almost certainly would have known each other. Both men were born in Delft in 1632, in fact, probably about a week apart. Both of them came from families that were involved in the textile business. Both of them spent their entire adult lives in Delft, which only had a population at the time of about 15,000, and they only lived a couple of blocks away from each other. So it's almost certain that they knew each other. For those of you who, when you look at this and you see the incredibly penetrating vision of Vermeer, as well as the vision of van Leeuwenhoek inventing the microscope, if you know anything about astrology, it's interesting to note that both men were Scorpios. The penetrating vision. Young woman with a water jug. Frederick Hart, who wrote an excellent history of Italian Renaissance art, said that Vermeer's compositions were, quote, conceived as a cube of shining space in which the figures and their transitory actions are forever suspended in light. Now, the woman appears to be opening a window so that she can water the flowers in a window box. But this humble, insignificant action here seems to be raised to the level of a holy sacramental act. The stability, the calm, and the serene harmony appear also because of the repeated use of quadrilateral forms there. On the wall, you see a map of northern and southern Netherlands. The Dutch were, by the way, the expert cartographers of the day, and large maps were often used in Holland in the 17th century as a cheap way of covering up wall space. Vermeer was also ahead of his time in color science. He knew that shadows are not colorless or black. He knew that adjoining colors will affect one another, and that light is composed of color. And this painting also demonstrates Vermeer's interest in reflected light. The brass pitcher picks up the blue cloth as a dark blue, and the red carpet is modified in the gold hue of the basin. Now, this painting might be familiar to most of you. A 19th century French critic once referred to this girl as La Joconde du Nord, the Mona Lisa of the North. You have this wonderful modeling of transparent shadows reflected by light. The sitter is unknown, although there have been lots and lots of stories about her. In fact, it's quite possible that she was one of Vermeer's older daughters. She appears to be wearing a glass so-called drop earring. These earrings were made of glass, but they were varnished to look like an immense oversized pearl. And those types of earrings were currently very fashionable in Holland. Now, Vermeer was able to counterfeit the illusion by painting the pearl with 2 layers of paint, a thin grayish one beneath a white highlight, which would permit him to depict both the highlights as well as the translucence. Cosmetics might also play a significant role in this painting. The moist lips have possibly been reddened with crayon. That's what they used to use before they invented lipstick. The eyes might be heightened with belladonna, which of course is poisonous, but they may not have known it at that time or figured it wouldn't do too much damage. And the cheeks may have been flushed with cochineal, which is a red coloring that comes from beetles. Now, you see again Vermeer's typical blue and yellow color scheme. The dark background was actually originally intended to be a deep enamel-like green, and there was a green glaze that he put over the black, but in the course of time, the green has faded. One painter and critic said that the substance of the paint seems as if it's made of crushed pearls melted together. And here, rather unusually for Vermeer, he's painted a city scene, a view of his native Delft. The artist was working from the second story of an inn, which has long since been torn down. And like other cityscape and landscape painters of the time, it's not an exact portrait because he was likely to move buildings around in order to create an ideal composition. Now, the placement of the buildings, that quiet atmosphere and the clear, even light create a sense of timeless stability. The shifting clouds allow patches of sunshine to come through that are illuminating areas of the scene. The buildings, as well as the lights and darks of the clouds, are beautifully reflected in the water. The figures actually echo the verticals of the spires and the towers, and at the same time, they give us a sense of scale. And he wanted a rougher surface texture for the stone facades and for the roofs. And so he accomplished that by using an exceptionally coarse lead white pigment mixed with grains of sand. And that brings us to one of the most outstanding artists in the history of Western art, Rembrandt van Rijn. He also uses strong tenebrous lighting, these contrasts of light and dark. But in Rembrandt's art, they become a means of creating character. Throughout his career, Rembrandt probed more and more deeply into the psychological states of the human soul. He rendered light and shadow into finer and finer nuances in order to express character, mood, and emotion. He's also one of the most profound painters of biblical scenes, interpreting the stories in human terms. It's very much a personal spiritual vision, which, as you'll see in his later work, is often depicted in terms of a spiritual stillness and an inward turning contemplation. Altogether, Rembrandt would leave nearly 100 self-portraits in drawings, prints, and paintings. And when we look over them chronologically, they actually appear like a visual autobiography. He was born, interestingly, in 1606 as the son of a miller, working class. But his father did not insist on his son going into the business with him. He recognized that his son had artistic talent. And so between 1621 and about 1625, he was apprenticed first to a painter in Leiden, then studied in Amsterdam with Peter Lastman. And Lastman was a painter of biblical scenes. Now, as you'll notice, there's not a lot of biblical art in Holland in the 17th century. And so this was rather unusual, and it was why Rembrandt took it up. Sometime between 1631 and 33, after several years of work in Leiden, he moved to Amsterdam, where there would be more patronage available. And there he achieved great success as a portrait painter. And in 1634, he was able to marry Saskia van Eulenburg, who was the daughter of a former mayor of the town of Leeuwarden. So here you see Rembrandt and his wife painting their double portrait as the prodigal son in the tavern. Rembrandt had a wonderful relationship with Saskia, and she often appears in his paintings. Here, he's celebrating his success as an artist and his happiness in his marriage. Now, this is also based on a popular genre in Holland, which was tavern scenes. Lots of painters painted those. Up on the left, upper left, if you look carefully, that's a tally board on the wall. That way the innkeeper could keep track of whose name was there and how many drinks they'd had. Yeah. Notice the pie on the table. That's a peacock pie. And peacocks, of course, are symbols of what? Pride. So it fits the painting. And the figures, you notice, they're actually wearing a mixture of historical and contemporary costumes. Rembrandt bought enormous supplies of studio props, including costumes, jewelry, weapons, and stuffed animals. Yeah. Supposedly, I'd heard a story, if this is actually true, that in Pittsburgh, my native town, in East Liberty, pronounced in Pittsburgh, East Liberty, there was a tavern that had a sort of a tally board on the wall. And it had a P above on one side and a Q on the other and a line drawn. It stood for pints and quarts. And so that way they would be able to keep track of people. And that's where the expression came from, mind your P's and Q's. Now, this fits in very much with Baroque 17th century painting that you'd see in other countries like Italy and France and so on. In other words, lots and lots of drama, and which is created also by the way he's using the light. His early religious works would often reflect this high Baroque drama. Now, Belshazzar was the crown prince of Babylon in the 6th century BC. And his father was Nebuchadnezzar, with whom the Israelites had lots of problems. And his son here is presiding at a feast that's being served on the gold and silver vessels that had been brought back by his father from Jerusalem as war booty. And what is he doing? What story is this from the Old Testament? Test your biblical knowledge. Very good, yes, the handwriting on the wall. And according to the account given in the book of Daniel, it reads, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, which is interpreted by Daniel. This is during the time of the so-called Babylonian captivity. But in fact, the ones that were saying we wept by the waters of Babylon, but those were only the fanatics. Actually, the Jews did quite well in Babylon, even though they had been taken into captivity. They reached high positions in society, advisors to rulers and everything else. And Daniel was quite valued because he was today what we would call highly psychic and could prophesy and interpret dreams and things like this. And when Daniel was brought in, he said directly to the prince, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that night there was an attack and Belshazzar was killed. And the kingdom did go to the Medes and Persians. One man's Mede is another man's Persian. Now, Jewish commentators on that story considered that Belshazzar wasn't able to read the handwriting because it was written from above to below instead of from right to left. And that's the way that Rembrandt depicted it, because Rembrandt was quite an intelligent man. He had numbers of friends because there were lots of Jews in Amsterdam where they had tolerance after being thrown out of Spain and Portugal in the 1490s. And he was aware of the commentary. Now, very strong chiaroscuro. We see here the difference between the shadows and what appears to be divine light. You can see how fear is etched on the faces. Belshazzar and the woman at the right are both spilling their drinks. The oriental splendor in Belshazzar's turban, jewelry, and gold-embroidered cloak, those are Rembrandt's studio props. And there's also, he makes use often of strong touches of impasto, which comes from a word in Italian meaning paste, where this paint is built up so thickly on the surface that it actually stands out from the surface. Expressive device. The head and bright sleeve of that woman at the right seem to extend into our space. It's a repoussoir device. And here we see a self-portrait. This is the beginning of Rembrandt's middle period. And now you can see by contrast, the paintings are starting to exhibit a more of subtlety of feeling. He's becoming more concerned with depicting the inner life rather than the outer actions. Now, one thing that he did in order to achieve his effects, his undercoating was often done in a deep reddish brown, and that would increase the sense of warmth, depth, and gravity. He's still representing himself in precious attire. He's wearing a richly embroidered shirt and an old-fashioned heavy fur-trimmed velvet coat. But there's no sensational appeal to the spectator here as there is in the earlier painting. He's also emphasizing the horizontal, the sill, the right arm leaning on it, the line of his mouth, the line of his eyes, and the position of the cap. This lends the picture a sense of stability and firmness and calm. This next one is one of his most famous works. Did you go to the Rijksmuseum when you were in Amsterdam? Those of you who have been in Holland? Okay. Right. The sortie of the Civic Guard Company of Captain Frans Banning Kok and Lieutenant Willem van Eulenborg, better known as the Night Watch. Now these are the officers and guardsmen who are being depicted in an action scene. It's a dress parade of the militia company on the occasion of the state visit of the Queen of France, Marie de Médicis, in 1638. This was intended to hang in the company's headquarters and meeting hall. Now, each man paid an average of 100 guilders to be depicted, more or less depending on how prominently he was shown. Notice this one fellow over here at the right. He mustn't have paid very much because an outstretched arm covers up everything but his eyes. Yeah. In 1715, the painting was moved to the town hall. And what did they do? They cut it, made it smaller on the top, the bottom, and both sides so that it would fit better into the room. Otherwise, we would see that the men are actually about to cross a bridge in the lower left. But again, in this painting, the popular title is a total misnomer, because after World War II, the painting was cleaned, and lo and behold, it's a daylight scene, not night, taking place in the early morning. The men are standing in front of a temporary arch that looks a little bit like an Italian arch, an old ancient Roman one that was erected for the state visit. And the order that they use is Tuscan Doric, which would be appropriate for Marie de Médicis because she was a member of the Medici family. Her father was the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Now, Captain Kok, the man with the red sash, notice how his left hand is coming out of the painting towards us. And Willem van Reitenborg, the lieutenant, look at the spear, both repoussoir devices. Being the captain of a civic guard company was often a way to being a stepping stone to high office. In fact, Kok himself was later elected to 4 one-year terms as mayor of Amsterdam. You see excited children running in and out. The girl in bright yellow has a chicken hanging from her belt. Now, that's actually a pun, a visual pun. What the men are carrying are a culver, which was the word for a musket. So from culver, you get the word cloveneer, meaning a musketeer. And cloven are claws, so it's actually a visual pun with the girl with the chicken. One man, you notice, is loading his musket through the muzzle. There's a boy who's wearing an antique costume, and he's firing his. And there's another man who's shown blowing away the powder that's left in the pan. Now, there appears to have been a little bit of grumbling among some of the men about the individual portraits, but there's a story that the painting was rejected, and that story is a complete and total myth. It is, however, true that about 1642, Rembrandt's career does begin to go downhill. His style was starting to fall out of public favor. Religious scenes only appealed in any case to a minority of people, and there was a change of taste that began in Amsterdam in the 1640s. The bright colors and the elegance of Anthony van Dyck came into fashion, and Rembrandt's style began to look more and more old-fashioned. It's also true that in that same year, only days before they would have celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary, Saskia died at the age of 30 from complications that resulted from the birth of their son Titus in the previous year. They had had 3 earlier children born to them, but none of them had survived more than 2 months. Now, a woman came to the house to serve as Titus's nurse. Her name was Gerda Dirks, and Rembrandt actually ended up starting a common law marriage with her. And that lasted for several years, but Dirks was apparently quite a shrew. And in 1649, Hendrikje Stoffels entered Rembrandt's house as a maid, and she became his mistress. She was 23, he was 43. Now, the story that happened with Gerda Dirks, that was a rather sad story, and doesn't show either one of them in a very good light. They had a bad falling out. There were lawsuits back and forth. At one point, he had given her jewelry that belonged to Saskia, and rather than giving it back, she'd pawned it. So he had her arrested, and she was confined in the Spinhuis, the spinning house. That was a women's prison. And so if you went there, you had to spend your days spinning cloth. Oh, so his relationship with Hendrikje, however, was just as fulfilling as his relationship with Saskia. But the problem was he couldn't marry her, because by the terms of Saskia's will, if Rembrandt remarried, he had to transfer his whole inheritance to Titus. And most of his property was actually tied up in paintings and art and bric-a-brac. It wasn't because Saskia was trying to be punitive. She simply wanted to make sure that their son would be cared for. Now, in 1654, 5 years after he had met her, Hendrikje became pregnant, and she was reprimanded by the local church council for, quote, living in sin with the painter Rembrandt, unquote. And she was refused the right to take Holy Communion. The result was that she bore him a daughter, Cornelia. And here is a painting in which Hendrikje serves as the model. She's being depicted here as Bathsheba. Now, do you remember the story from the Old Testament? King David sees her from the window of his palace and is immediately smitten with her, and then arranges to have her husband put in the front lines in a battle where he's killed. And then he summons her to the palace. And that is what has just happened. Hendrikje is being depicted as Bathsheba, and she's troubled over the adultery that she's summoned to commit with the king. You can see she's holding the letter in her hand. And Rembrandt has depicted Bathsheba as a tragic heroine, less sinner than sinned against, because normally in art, Bathsheba would be considered the archetypal fallen woman. And we see this incredible tension in that painting between the voluptuousness of the body with this beautiful, soft and mellow painting of the flesh, contrasted with her troubled mind and her innermost thoughts. This is his portrait of Jan Six. Six was a distinguished humanist, poet, and lawyer And in fact, many years later, in 1691, he would be elected mayor of Amsterdam at the age of 73. The coloristic splendor dominates the chiaroscuro in this painting. He's wearing a gray coat with gold buttons and a scarlet gold braided mantle, and he's either putting on or pulling off a chamois glove. The grays form this beautiful contrast with the reds, the golds, and that thick, creamy white impasto. And the brushwork is very free and broad. Rembrandt perfectly captures the psychological moment when Six's gaze has turned from the outer world to his inner self. And this is Rembrandt's greatest group portrait, the Syndics of the Drapers Guild. The syndics were sampling masters. They were drapers who were elected to assess the quality of the cloth that the weavers were offering members of their guild for sale. Now, equal importance has been given to each of the 5 officials as well as their servant who's standing behind them. It's a profound psychological grasp of all of the personalities. The group is unified through the horizontals, 3 of them running through the painting at almost equal intervals. The lowest horizontal is the edge of the table and the arm of the chair at the left. The middle line is the prevailing level of the heads, and the upper one is the line of the wainscoting. The men appear to be seated on a platform. The man near the center is making a gesture with his right hand that would be employed by an orator who would be demonstrating evidence. He appears to be appraising a length of cloth against exemplars that would be in a book of swatches. Now, the syndics met in private, but all the men in the painting are looking at one point, and one man you can see is starting to rise. Substantially, he's giving the illusion that the group is reacting to an entering spectator. And that low viewpoint from which the group is portrayed, the painting was intended to hang fairly high, contributes to the illusionistic effect. Now, Rembrandt was also one of the most outstanding makers of etchings in the history of art. Are you familiar at all with the etching process? It starts with a metal plate, like many things like engravings and dry points and so on, and it would be coated with a ground that consisted of a thinned down asphalt. And then what you would do, you would take an etching needle and you would draw the design on the plate. It would cut right through the ground and reveal the plate. Then you'd take the plate and you'd put it in a weak acid bath, and the acid would etch out the lines. Now, that means you could redo the plate. You could stop out some of the other lines that you'd already made with ground, and then re-immerse it, and the ones that were still exposed on the plate would be cut deeper. And that means the lines would hold more ink, and hence they would appear darker. The process had been invented early in the previous century, but had only been perfected in the late 1500s. And he has actually combined it with 2 other techniques, because he also used a burin and a dry point needle when he did the plate. Now, at the left, down below, we have a fisherman. There's a woman seated beside him on the bank with a basket, and you can see a cart and horses up on the crest of the hill. This has sometimes been interpreted as religious in nature and representing the 3 crosses on Golgotha as darkness falls over Jerusalem. However, fishing was also sometimes symbolic of seduction. And in fact, if you were to investigate that very carefully, hidden in the foliage over the right is an amorous couple. This one, a biblical scene, has always been called the 100 guilder print, after the price paid for it during Rembrandt's lifetime, which was considered extremely expensive because it was more than most paintings would have cost at the time. His religious art became more and more profound as he grew older. So there's more of an emphasis on there's no emphasis here on the power of the will and superficial emotions. Instead, he's revealing what lies behind the visible appearances, the domain of the spirit. It's quite possible that when he was in his 40s, he became associated with the Mennonites. They were started by Menno Simons, who was a Dutch priest. And in his day, the Mennonites were a liberal sect. They were milder than the rather severe Dutch Calvinists. They were pacifists. They were opposed to war, military service, and slavery. They held to freedom of conscience. They practiced love thy neighbor, and they believed in ultimate forgiveness. Now, what you see depicted here, he has conflated a number of episodes from the life of Christ. 3 of them, in fact, from the 19th chapter of Matthew. Pharisees are debating with Christ about marriage and divorce. They're standing over at the left and they're debating with each other. And they're genuine Jewish types, because Rembrandt began to observe the Jews in Amsterdam more and more carefully, and he would depict their physiognomies as accurately as possible, because in that way, his biblical representations would look more authentic. You also see the episode here of "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." You notice there's 2 children being brought to Jesus. To the left is the rich but sorrowful young man who's not willing to give up all his possessions to follow Christ. There's a woman lying on the ground at Christ's feet. That's the woman who had been infirm for 18 years and is about to be cured. Over on the right, we see a blind man being led to Christ by an old woman. And at the far right, there is actually a black man depicted. In other words, he's referring to the universality of Christ's message. 2 of the men at left are actually based on a bust of Socrates and the features of Erasmus, the Dutch humanist. And the figure of Christ, as you can see, simply radiates warmth and love. Now, if Rembrandt had one personal failing, it was financial. The man could not handle money very well. Whenever he had money, he spent it like a drunken sailor on a spree. And so he was filling up the studio with all these props and costumes and jewelry and paintings by other artists. And finally, in 1655, he was forced to hold a week-long sale of his possessions in a fruitless attempt to avert financial disaster. Between 1656 and 1660, the court processed Rembrandt's bankruptcy. So he was forced to sell his house. He and Titus and Hendrikje had to move into a cheaper section of Amsterdam, and he had to sell his household goods and most of the art that he had collected. They hit on a very good scheme, however. Titus was a young man by this point. So he and Hendrikje together went into partnership and started an art dealership, and they listed Rembrandt as one of their employees. And that way, he was enabled to continue to sell his work rather than have it confiscated by creditors. And here we see a later self-portrait. Interesting, he's only 53 in that painting. There's no idealization. He's really revealing himself as a private person who's been battered by misfortune and ravaged by care. But the sorrows have deepened his understanding. You see a vulnerable human being, but you see no resentment or sense of self-pity. And what is very typical of his later portraits, look at the light illuminating his face. That seems to be the light of his inner spirit, which is shining out of him. Color in Rembrandt's work loses nothing in warmth and intensity as his career continues. Now, the name The Jewish Bride, that was a name that was coined in the early 19th century because a collector identified the subject as a Jewish father bestowing a necklace on his daughter on her wedding day. However, that explanation is no longer accepted at all. For one thing, the couple look absolutely nothing like the Jewish types depicted by Rembrandt. It may represent Isaac caressing his wife Rebecca, which is mentioned in the 26th chapter of Genesis, verse 8. Rembrandt had done a drawing of the same theme earlier. And what you're probably seeing here is a young Dutch couple who are being depicted in the guise of Rebecca and Isaac. Christopher White, in his book on Rembrandt, says, "One of the greatest expressions of the tender fusion of spiritual and physical love in the history of painting." And Seymour Slive adds, "The fluctuating character of his colors produces the impression of a dynamic interconnection between all substances and links the subjects with their mysterious dark background." Here you see a detail. Look at the paint. His ingenious brushwork combines these thick passages of impasto with subtle glazing, and it produces a kind of an up and down movement in the relief of the paint and makes the forms look like they're floating. Rembrandt's later religious paintings become more personal and more somber. This is one of his most moving religious works. Joseph has brought his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to be blessed by his father Jacob. In other words, the older son is to get the birthright. Now, Jacob, however, places his right hand on his younger son's head, and he's pushing Manasseh back with the fingers of his left hand. And Joseph is gently attempting to remove his father's hand from Ephraim, thinking his father's old and confused. But Jacob then prophesies that the younger son will be greater than the older. And the Christian interpretation of that was that Ephraim represented the coming of the Christian faith and Manasseh the Jews. And to the side is Joseph's wife, standing there with an expression of motherly feeling about the deep significance of this event. Rembrandt's life continued to be difficult. In 1663, Hendrikje died of the plague. She was 37 years old. In the following year, his son Titus died at the age of 27, leaving a posthumous daughter. And in the following year, Rembrandt died himself. This is one of his last paintings and one of the most moving pictures in the history of religious art. This is, you could say, Rembrandt's spiritual testament to the world. There's a mood of absolute quiet and calm, and the impact is increased by the lighting, the simplicity of the setting, and the warm red of the father's cloak. The emphasis is on that tender, forgiving face of the father gently embracing his son. Now, early in his career, Rembrandt had depicted himself as the prodigal son. Now, nearing the end of his life, he's portraying this deeply felt image of humble repentance, forgiveness, and spiritual homecoming. The darkness of human existence is here being illuminated by the tenderness and mercy of God. Now, in addition to Hals, Vermeer, and Rembrandt, we have dozens of men who were referred to as the little masters or minor masters in Holland. And they specialized in genre, landscape, seascape, portraiture, architectural painting, still life, and even in subcategories of those. But the name is slighting because many of these men rose to a high rank of originality and quality. And what you'll see when you look at some of these is that the Dutch wanted paintings that depicted themselves, their activities, and their environment. Now I want to show you this one. Carl Fabritius was probably the most brilliant and original of Rembrandt's pupils. He had several dozen pupils. He was outstanding as a teacher, and a number of his pupils became outstanding artists in their own right. Fabritius had originally worked as a carpenter, which is where his surname comes from. Fabritius is Latin and means somebody basically who makes something. He settled in Delft in 1654. That self-portrait is downright sensuous and looks also a bit defiant. He's looking at the viewer with a very direct gaze of an accomplished an independent master. You see black chest hair exposed, and he's set against a wall of peeling plaster. There's a heavy impasto in the painting, which is derived from Rembrandt, though Fabricius preferred to put a dark figure against a light background, whereas Rembrandt himself would have preferred the opposite arrangement. And if you look at the small painting that he did of the goldfinch, which is only a little over 13 inches in height, that is a unique work in Dutch 17th century painting. It's also a type of painting we refer to as trompe-l'œil, which is French and means fool the eye, because it looks so realistic you might mistake it for reality. The bird's feeder is attached to a wall, and it consists of 2 half rings and a blue container. The bird is sitting on the top ring, to which it's chained by 1 foot, and it turns a strongly foreshortened head towards us, inquisitively. Goldfinches were popular as pets because they could be trained to draw water from a bowl with a miniature bucket. Fabricius's interests, though, in the atmospheric effects of clear daylight and the cool harmony of colors in his light tonality, might have actually wound up being an influence on Vermeer. Tragically, Fabricius's career was cut short at the age of 32. There was a gunpowder storage magazine in the city of Delft, quite a large one, and every once in a while, when they got around to it, they'd actually do an inspection. On the 12th of October in 1654, the war with Spain was already over by now, some of the city officials decided it was time to go down and check it out, and they were carrying candles. And once they were down there, there was suddenly an explosion of 90,000 pounds of gunpowder, which leveled several city blocks, killed several dozen people, was referred to as the Delft thunderclap. And one of the people who was a victim was Fabricius. He was painting a sitter in his house at the time, and the house collapsed on them. He was rushed to the hospital, but died without regaining consciousness. Now, the work I have left here would be too long to fit into the 45 minutes we have left. So what I'm going to do is take some examples of each of these different subjects in painting and show you a couple of outstanding masters who depicted it. Now here we have one by Hendrik Averkamp, very early in the century. He was actually mute. He wasn't able to speak, and so he was referred to as De Stomme van Kampen, meaning the mute of Kampen, the name of the town in which he lived. Averkamp was one of the first to specialize in winter scenes of outdoor sports and leisure. We're looking, in fact, at genre scenes, scenes from everyday life. And you see this kind of a bird's eye view. It was taken from Flemish painting that actually specialized in that. And when you have a high bird's eye point of view, automatically you get a very high horizon line. And you see people of all ages skating and sledging and fishing. And you also notice that they're playing a game. What are they playing? Like this fellow here. They're playing golf, C-O-L-F. Golf. Yeah, this golf, this is where it was invented. It was developed in the 13th century, and then Scottish traders carried it to St. Andrews in Scotland. And there were many ordinances against the popularity of the new sport due to numerous broken windows. And so when the lakes and the canals would freeze over, the players would take to the ice because it was an ideal playing surface and gave them plenty of space. And you often see that depicted in winter scenes. Peter de Hoogh. His most popular scenes would show a child with either its mother or a nurse in either an interior or a courtyard, engaged in some domestic occupation. The painting is tender, but at the same time, it's free of sentimentality. You see these trim and neat Dutch gardens and courtyards in his work, And he emphasizes rectangular forms, which will often frame the figures. Frequently, he leaves a door open, so we have a glimpse into an adjoining space. We know very little about de Hoog's life, but we do know that in 1684, he died in Amsterdam's insane asylum, but we don't know what the circumstances were. Now I'm going to go a few here. Judith Leister. The few Dutch women artists usually came from households where the craft was either a family tradition or the family was intellectual and well-to-do and they were encouraging their daughters to acquire artistic skills as a form of polite social accomplishment, something that would befit a young lady. Leister, however, was actually the daughter of a Flemish weaver who had emigrated to Holland after the fall of Antwerp to the Spanish in 1585. Her father had started a brewery and failed and ended up bankrupt. She became a gifted follower of Frans Hals, and in fact, Hals himself was the son of a Flemish immigrant who had come from Antwerp. She may even have actually worked with Hals in some capacity for a time. And she had the great good fortune to be praised by a writer for her artistic skills when she was still in her late teens. At the age of 24, she became the first woman to be admitted to Haarlem's Guild of St. Luke. And then sadly, she virtually stopped painting after she married an artist at the age of 27 and became a Dutch housewife and the mother of 5 children. And the quality of this painting shows the loss to the art world of this young talent. Note the subtle gradations of the values of gray on the wall, and that beautiful color harmony of the boy's red cap, olive green jacket, violet trousers, and the mottled green chair. This next man is one of the most popular genre painters in the history of Holland, Jan Steen. He ran a brewery, and like Vermeer, he later kept an inn. And his humor is much loved by the Dutch today. In fact, in Dutch today, they have an expression, a Jan Steen household. That's one that's lively and untidy. Steen was a master at portraying children. And one thing rather unusual about him, he was Catholic. Now, this is the Feast of St. Nicholas. On the eve of 6th of December, St. Nicholas comes to the Netherlands. Guess where he comes from? Spain. You can see a strong Spanish influence, even though they had fought for their independence. And the children, they don't hang out stockings, they get gifts in their shoes. So the good ones get cakes and candy and toys. The bad ones either get lumps of coal or a birch rod with which to spank them. You notice the little girl has a doll that represents St. John the Baptist and a bucket of sweets. Her brother is playing with a golf club and a ball. The older brother's crying. He's received a birch rod in his shoe, which is held by the maid. Meanwhile, down below, the younger brother's pointing at him and laughing and looking out at the viewer at the same time. And in that way, it makes us a part of the family scene. However, the grandmother is also beckoning the naughty brother over to the bed where there's a present hidden. And down in the foreground, we have this interesting still life showing special breads and waffles and things like that that they would eat in Christmas time. And in the background is a man pointing up the chimney to show the children where St. Nicholas made his entry. Low-life scenes taking place in taverns or carousers in the open air were a very popular subject in 17th century Holland and were part of a tradition that went back to the previous century. You see it in the work of Peter Bruegel occasionally too in Flanders. Now, there's scenes of revelry that go on here, and for some reason there's lots of eggshells on the floor in any of these tavern scenes that he shows. And you see that there's an old lecher who's attempting to be amorous with the tavern owner. And here's his painting, Leaving the Tavern. As one writer put it, judging from the conditions of some of the patrons, they may not all have left voluntarily. Now, at this point, I want to get into the subject of landscape because this is where Holland really comes into its own. Before this, and even after this in Catholic countries, they'd paint this beautiful landscape and then you'd have to put a biblical subject right in the foreground just to give you an excuse for painting it. But the Dutch were totally happy to do perfectly pure landscapes. And it was derived from Flemish landscape. 17th century Dutch landscapes are not just topographical records. The painters actually approached nature with feelings of almost religious awe and devotion. And the best masters showed lots of creative imagination. The visual elements were often modified or rearranged. And the type of landscape evolved emphasizing a unified, moisture-laden atmosphere and an impressive sense of spaciousness. Also, we see the Baroque drama as it's going to be coming up in these paintings in the sky, the clouds, because often more than half of the painting can consist of the sky. In one case, it's 9/10. Gillis van Koningslo is one of the very early painters. He was from Fleming, from Antwerp as well. So he left in 1585 when it fell to the Spanish, and he settled at first in Frankenthal, near the German city of Frankfurt, and lived with a colony of landscape artists. And then he moved to Amsterdam in 1595, where he lived until his death about 10 years later. Now, he's deriving that, as you can see on the left, from Flemish landscapes. So the characteristics of Flemish would include these semi-aerial bird's-eye panoramic views with craggy mountain ranges that you'd see in the distance and a high horizon. And the scenes are often illustrational. In other words, they serve as a stage for a biblical or a mythological scene. The emphasis is on figures with a landscape background, and they're not yet unified by the atmosphere. But in his later paintings, like the one on the right, he starts painting these majestic forests in which he's starting to break with the Flemish tradition and depicting landscapes in which the people would simply be completely dwarfed by the trees. And this would be a romantic mood that would evoke this luxuriant nature, and that would become his subject and would strongly influence the further development of landscape painting in Holland. Now here we have a painting by Jan van Goyen. He was a dealer and a valuer of paintings. He arranged auction sales. He speculated in tulip bulbs, which became a runaway craze in that country in the 17th century. He also speculated in land and houses, and he painted altogether about 1,200 paintings. They're not exactly rare. Nevertheless, the man was in continual money difficulties, and when he died, he left 18,000 guilders in outstanding debts. His daughter married Jan Steen. Now, landscape painting goes through two phases. The first one goes from about 1620 to about 1650, and this is referred to as the tonal phase of landscape. This humid atmosphere throws a veil over everything and creates this almost monochromatic gray or grayish-green tonality with transparent browns in the shadows. The earlier Flemish tradition of a landscape background for figures has now become a landscape with figures added. Now, Van Goyen depicted Rhenen at least 26 times, and apparently that place had a real attraction for a lot of different artists. The tall church tower anchors the composition. And you see shipping going on the river. There's 3 men in a boat in the backwater in the foreground, foot travelers, a coach, and a man on horseback. And it's a vision of peace and harmony, lightening in tone from the dark foreground in strips to that infinite expanse of land and water at the horizon. Now I'm going to skip over Solomon van Restal and go on to his much more famous nephew, Jacob van Restal, one of the greatest painters of the century. Now, Jacob van Restal is really, this is characteristic of the classical phase of landscape, which lasted from about 1650 to about 1690. As you can see, it's much more monumental. You have strong contrasts of solid forms. It will center usually on a windmill, a tree, an animal, which you see against the sky. And these forms become the focus of the composition. In fact, they take on something like a heroic character. In classical landscapes, the light breaks through the clouds with greater intensity, and the clouds themselves gain in substance and volume. Now, Van Restal is considered the greatest of Dutch landscape painters. He painted virtually every subject that Dutch landscape painters covered. As one writer put it, quote, dunes and country roads, grain fields, panoramas, rivers and canals, woods and forests, ruins, winter scenes, waters and windmills, city views, mountain scenes, Scandinavian landscapes, seascapes, and views of beaches. Now, he was a nephew of the man that I would have shown you just before, Solomon. You notice that the sky is responding to in its cloud formations to the wings of the windmill, which here has been greatly exaggerated in size, so that it takes on the same kind of heroic presence as Roman ruins in a classical landscape. The body of water is the river Lech, which is a branch of the Rhine. And to the left of the mill in the distance, you can see the 15th century Archbishop's Castle. Now, the town actually had a town wall, and there would have been a gate right there called the Vrouwenpoort, meaning the women's gate. And he's eliminated the wall and the gate, but he's put 3 figures of women just to allude to it. And he also emphasizes the palings along the riverbank, which constantly had to be renewed in order to protect the land from floods. Van Restel painted several views of his native city of Haarlem. Now, here you do see something of the economic means of production. You see what's going on here? They're bleaching linen. After brewing, linen bleaching was the town's major industry. He's found an elevated viewpoint. You're standing up on top of a sand dune. And the height is also increased, first of all, by making the painting a vertical painting, and then having those towering cumulus clouds. And the expanse of land has been richly differentiated by alternating bands of light and shadow. And breaking up the flat horizon, we have the Cathedral of St. Bavo, where Van Restal will eventually be buried. This painting of the Jewish cemetery, he did 2 different versions of it. It's actually a moralizing landscape with a strong mood of melancholy. It's expressing the transience and the vanity of human life and all of its endeavors. And in fact, paintings like still life paintings, as you'll see, they all had this kind of meaning of being a vanitas, a vanity, that everything is passing. So we see tombs, we see ruins, a dead beech tree, broken trunks, and a rushing stream that's forcing its way between ancient graves. Light, however, is now breaking through the clouds, and you see a rainbow and luxuriant foliage over at the right, which gives hope and the promise of eternal life. And Van Restal used thicker paint than the tonal landscape painters, which gives his foliage a new and richer quality. Those 3 tombs that you see can actually still be seen today in a Portuguese Jewish cemetery at Ouderkerk near Amsterdam. But the landscape is a fantasy, because the ruins you see up above come from an abbey church that's at Alkmaar, about 25 miles away from where the tombs are. In the late 1650s and 1660s, waterfalls in mountainous northern valleys, Scandinavian, became important themes in his body of work. However, he never visited Scandinavia. He was taking the forms from another painter. And this one, always loved this painting. It's in the Hermitage in Russia. A marsh in a forest. As one writer pointed out, the trees in Van Restal's works seem like personalities. You can feel the vital force of their organic growth. And in fact, he's really the first artist in history who's able to represent a variety of trees that are consistently recognizable to a botanist. And here, Meindert Halbema is the only documented pupil of Van Restal. And as you notice, his mood is somewhat less brooding and sunnier than his teachers. Halbema would paint the orderly beauty of the Dutch countryside under luminous skies and in sparkling daylight. And his favored motifs were sunny forest scenes opened by roads, glistening ponds, fairly flat landscapes with scattered tree groups, and especially watermills. He painted almost 36 paintings of watermills, far more than any of his contemporaries. He also painted less after he took a good-paying job as a wine gauger. But late in his career, he painted this, which is in the National Gallery in London. It's an elegant avenue of pollarded alder trees, which had been planted in 1665, and the trees lead the eye to the village and into the sky. And you have an uncultivated grove over on the left, which is contrasted with the planted saplings on the right. Another outstanding landscape painter, Albert Cuyp. Now here, cattle are the heroic and monumental forms that we see against the sky. You have that strong horizontal of that standing cow, which is echoed in the hazy distance of the rolling country, and the cow lends strength and structure to the whole design. Cuyp was active in his native town of Dordrecht. That golden sunlight of a late afternoon is an all-pervading element in his work, which imparts this timeless and poetic quality. And here we see his view of the River Maas at Dordrecht. He knew Dutch river life intimately. The fishing fleet is in, the ship in the foreground is flying a Dutch flag, expressing Dutch pride in their maritime prosperity. He also made out all right financially for a painter in that century. He gave up painting shortly after marrying a wealthy widow. Now, Dutch artists also discovered the beauties of Italian motifs. They're referred to as Italianate painters. During the 17th and 18th centuries, when the classical aesthetic were ranking Poussin and Claude Lorrain as the greatest English landscapists, Italianate Dutch landscapers were more highly esteemed than those who painted their own native countryside. That changed in the 19th century. Dutch painters of the Italian Campagna were considered un-Dutch, but in recent years there's been a reappraisal and a new appreciation for them. Now here we have one, Peter van Laar. Now in Italy, painters always got a nickname, or most of the time, and he was known there as Bamboccio. The reason is because he was deformed physically. And a bamboccio is actually an Italian expression meaning an awkward simpleton or a puppet. Now, hostile critics would later call his followers bamboccianti. And until the late 19th century, the term would be more or less synonymous with low-life genre painting. But he settled in Rome in 1625 or 26 and stayed there until 1638 when he came back to the city of Haarlem. In fact, he would go out with Poussin and Lorrain on sketching trips in Rome. And this charming painting, a ciambella, is basically like the Italian version of a bagel. And it's a simple moment in the life of humble people, but you don't see any trace of anecdotal or picturesque effects. I'm going to move up 2 here. Nicholas Berchem was another of the Italianate artists. He painted every type of painting in Holland you can imagine, but never painted a still life, despite the fact that his father was a still life painter. He probably visited Italy in the 1650s, and he was incredibly industrious because Today extant, we have over 850 paintings, about 500 drawings, and 50 etchings attributed to him. On more than one occasion, Jacob van Reesdahl hired him to paint the figures in his paintings, which is something that landscape painters would occasionally do. Now, I'm going to move up now to a different subject altogether. Seascapes. The life of the Dutch was inextricably bound up with the sea, and from the earliest times, its economy was bound up with seafaring. During the 17th century, much of the wealth of the country came from the overseas trade, and the Dutch were more powerful on the seas than the English during the first half of the century. During the second half, there would be 3 different Anglo-Dutch wars, all fought at sea. In fact, what's interesting is because of so much of the country being reclaimed from the sea, when you take the bus from the city of Amsterdam out to the airport, you have to imagine that at one point, sea battles actually took place over your head, about 30 or 40 feet up. So, the Dutch got the worst in the wars with the English. The second one cost them their colonies of New Netherland and the city of New Amsterdam, both of which were renamed New York. Not surprisingly, marine painting was a great specialty and very popular in Holland. And the patrons would have been people familiar with the sea and sailing vessels and ships under sail, so they were probably very critical and discriminating. Now, Jan Portcellus, actually in seascape painting, we have the same progression as in landscape, starting with tonal seascapes like this one, where everything is in a kind of a gray or grayish-green tonality that unifies all of the forms, and which lasts until about 1650. Portcellus's main concerns were choppy or stormy seas, a palpable atmosphere, overcast skies, and simple working boats. The sky and the sea are his real subjects, not grand portraits of ships or historical events. And the great sense of naturalism and a somber mood, and you can see how bursts of sunshine are indicating that the storm is now coming to an end. There's a great spaciousness in this that's created by that extensive stretch of beach and the sand dunes and the low horizon. Leading artists collected Portcellus's paintings. Rubens owned 1, Rembrandt owned 6. The result was Portcellus was fortunate. He died wealthy. Jan van de Capelle shows the transition to the classical phase of seascape painting. Now, most of his marine paintings represent the mouths of wide rivers or quiet inner harbors where groups of ships are either parading or lie at anchor in mirror-smooth waters, which are perfect for displaying reflections. Normally, the painting is either early morning or early evening, and the masts make a pattern of verticals that are coordinated with the horizontals of the hulls and the low horizon. He's also known for his very full cloud formations, the transparent shadows, and the subtlety of those reflections in the waters. He too was fortunate financially. His father owned a dye works, and he inherited it, and as a result died very wealthy. However, the 2 greatest marine artists were Willem van de Velde the Elder and Willem van de Velde the Younger. Now, Van de Velde the Elder would dominate or document historic naval engagements, but not from secondary sources, which would be done by most marine painters. Instead, just like a later war correspondent, he'd serve as his own eyewitness and accompany the fleet. And on more than one occasion, he sketched a sea battle from a small boat. This is, in fact, a pen and ink drawing that he did of the last battle of the First Anglo-Dutch War. And he actually depicts himself in that drawing, sketching from the deck of a ship in the foreground. Now, ironically, He and his son both moved to England at the time of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, where they found favor with King Charles II and with his brother James, the Duke of York. And the king instructed the Admiralty to grant Willem the Elder 100 pounds annually, quote, for the taking and making drafts of sea fights. And the son would receive the same amount of money for, quote, putting the said drafts into colors for our particular use. And during the war, the two men would make trips to Holland because they were still painting for patrons in that country. The father and son produced a prodigious number of drawings. Together, over 2,100 of them still exist. And here we have the work of his son, two of his paintings, who depicted about every type of European vessel known. These two are sometimes considered pendants, meaning the two paintings were supposed to be hung on a wall next to each other. But that does not apparently work here because, first of all, the compositions are not complementary and the paintings are not the same dimensions. In the cannon shot that you see on the left, which is technically entitled Dutch Ship Getting Underway After Firing a Salute, you can see it's discharging smoke from the cannon shot, and which directs your view to the far distance, where the horizontals of the smaller craft counter the vertical of the sails of the ship. Now, if you want to know how that would be described by a sailor, the lines of rigging are remarkably precise and sensitively drawn. The fore and mainsails are loosed, the fore topsail is half hoisted, and the main topsail is mast-headed and hauled out to a bowline. And in English ships driven before a gale, you can see the ships pitching and heeling under the storm clouds that are beginning to blow away. You can see also that the ship has the foresail half lowered and the forestay's been cut away. That way, the sail blows out horizontally and doesn't catch the wind. Now I'm going to move ahead here. Here we have two painters who specialized in architectural interiors, Peter Sanradam and Emmanuel de Witte. And I'm going to concentrate here on de Witte. You can see there's a major difference between the two. Sanradam had this love of plain surfaces and lots of light. De Witte liked this contrast of light and shadow. Now, he would sometimes depict aspects of different churches, in other words, to create an ideal church interior. Usually, he'd populate the churches with church-goers, as well as with their dogs. That was an everyday situation that sometimes got out of hand. There were churches in Holland that would hire people to chase stray dogs out of the churches during services. Now, de Witte was also a history painter and a portraitist, and he depicted harbor and market scenes as well. He worked first in his native town of Alkmaar and then Delft and finally settled in Amsterdam. But de Witte had a troubled and difficult life. He certainly had an unstable character. Today they would probably come up with some kind of a syndrome that they would say he suffered from. Following the death of his first wife, he married a woman named Lisbeth, who was 23 years old at the time. He was in his 40s. And it seems that the new wife exercised something of an unwholesome influence on de Witte's 17-year-old daughter, because in 1658, the wife and daughter were both apprehended in the act of trying to steal from a neighbor. So his wife, who was pregnant, was banished from the city for 6 years, and in fact, 5 years later, she died outside the walls of the city, and the daughter was sentenced to a year in the spinning house. Later, de Witte was in a very poor financial position, so he was forced to indenture himself to a notary, an art dealer, and he would surrender all of his work to this man in exchange for board and lodging and 800 guilders a year. However, he broke the contract, was sued, and had to indenture himself several times again. Debts continued to plague him, which was not helped by the fact that he was also addicted to gambling. And several patrons provided him with support, but the relations did not usually work out very well because de Witte tended to yell at his clients and also at people who would try to watch him at work in the churches. It all came to a head during the winter of 1691 and 92. De Witte, who was now in his mid-70s, got into an argument with his landlord about the rent, and so he went out and hanged himself from a canal bridge. But the rope broke, and De Witte fell in the canal and drowned. And that night, the canal froze over, and it was 11 weeks later before they found the body. And here is his painting of the inside of the Portuguese synagogue at Amsterdam. Now, the Jews had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497, and some of them who wished to experience freedom of religion, they went to Holland because it was a very tolerant country. Now, when they went there, they would often call themselves Portuguese Jews, even if they were Spanish, because they didn't want the Dutch to know that they were from Spain. This was the new synagogue. It had actually been built in the 1670s, and there's visual interest heightened by the addition in the foreground of a man in a cape and dogs. I guess there are Jewish dogs too. And that will bring us to the last subject we want to talk about today, and that is still life. Now, still life actually comes from a Dutch term, stilleven, which was coined about 1650. No other country produced still lifes in such quantity or quality, and it reflects the Dutch love of domestic culture. Now, still lifes had already been invisible in 15th century Netherlandish paintings, often as disguised symbolism. And you often see the theme of the vanitas, the transience of all human endeavor. Now, Caravaggio had once said, it takes as much craftsmanship to paint a good picture of flowers as one of figures. And he knew because his first painting teacher in northern Italy had been a man who specialized in still life, which was very unusual in Italy. Now, this is Peter Claus. He was the father of Nicholas Berchem, the Italian painter who never painted a still life despite the fact that his father was Peter Claus. Still life painting, like landscape and seascape, goes through two phases. The first phase lasts from about 1620 to about 1640, and it emphasizes what is referred to as a breakfast piece, a simple meal set near the corner of a table that suggests a light breakfast or a snack. And you nearly always find repoussoir elements in these still life paintings. For example, look at the way the pewter plate's edge is extended off the table towards us, has herrings lying on it, and look at the bone handle of the knife. And you have transience expressed as well. For example, the braziers holding glowing coals. You have a tobacco pipe. You have an overturned jug and a half-consumed glass of ale, and the herrings, which aren't going to stay fresh very long. Always remember, fish and guests smell after 3 days. From the same period, Willem Claes Hede has slightly more expensive taste than Claus. So we see oysters in his paintings depicted more often than herrings, and the tableware is more ornate as well. You notice, though, that there's a monochromatic harmony that unifies the objects with these sensitive contrasts of values. In other words, it corresponds to the contemporary tonal landscape. And here, the repoussoir elements, you see a roll of paper that, right here, that would have held, there it is, which would have held tobacco, and that partially peeled lemon. These partially peeled lemons seem to appear in a number of these still life paintings. And also you see the way it comes out of the space towards us. Also you see symbols of transience, a broken glass in the back, the half-consumed glass of rum, the overturned cup, the partially peeled lemon, the roll of tobacco, the oysters, which of course will not remain fresh very long, and the signs of what look like a hasty departure. And look at the rum glass and how it's reflecting multiple light sources. Now, after about 1640, we have the second phase of still life painting come in, And that would be referred to as a pronkstilleven. Pronk means sumptuousness or ostentatiousness, because after about 1640, Dutch prosperity was increasing. And so still life paintings starts to show more precious objects and more luxury items. The patrons presumably belonged to the upper echelons of society, and they made no secret of the fact that they had expensive tastes. Now, Willem Kalf had worked in Paris with Flemish artists in the 1640s, and he married a woman who was a poet and a calligrapher and also an engraver of glass. And Kalf has this ability to impart a mysterious quality to the precious things he paints. Shows a noble sense of restraint and a remarkable choice of light and color accents. And the combination that he does of vertical and horizontal elements give his painting a kind of monumental quality. Now, like Vermeer, Kalf liked a blue and yellow color scheme. He favored peeled lemons, as well as Chinese bowls or Delftware. Now, here we have Jan Davids de Heem. You'll see a lot of Dutch painters whose middle name will end in SZ, which means that originally, when it's fully spelled out, you'd have OON after it. Davidzoon, son of David, a patronymic. Here's a table of desserts. Looks a little more ostentatious than Peter Claus's breakfast piece. De Heem would paint these abundant objects on tables piled high with exquisite trappings, expensive fruit, and precious metal vessels. Also displays here a globe, books, and a lute. And de Heem's work was often copied in later centuries. Here's another pronkstilleven. Abraham van Beieren. He would paint these sumptuous compositions in which he includes things like lobsters, fruit, including cantaloupes and pomegranates, expensive tableware, and rich draperies. And a soft silvery light unifies these fine color harmonies. The vanitas also appears because if you'll notice, there is an open timepiece sitting there, and someplace over to the right, there is a mouse. I can't remember exactly. I think it's, oh, there it is right there. Apparently a later owner of the painting objected to the mouse and somebody painted it out. And it wasn't rediscovered until the 1980s when the painting was cleaned. Now, still life had different types of subjects. This is a hunting still life by Jan Baptist Weenix, who was the son of an architect. He wasn't able to speak very well due to a medical condition, but his mother noted that he had a love of books, so she apprenticed him to work for a bookseller. Couldn't deal with him because all Weenix wanted to do was draw pictures. Early in his career, he painted Italian landscapes. In fact, on one occasion, he even traveled to Italy with Nicholas Berchem. But later in his life, he became a leading painter of hunting still lifes. The partridge makes a strong illusionistic effect, almost trompe-l'oeil. Look at the nail and the cord and how realistic they look. Still lifes of hunting trophies appeared first in the 1640s, and they gradually gained ground. Hunting had been a privilege of the aristocracy, and there were still ordinances on the books that specified who could hunt what type of game, how, and when. Now, only the nobility was allowed to shoot partridges, but that painting might possibly have given a middle-class owner a feeling of prestige. Now, we only have a couple of paintings yet to go, and one of the most popular types of still life was the flower piece. That had been established as an independent category in the previous century. And there was also at the same time a rise of a widespread interest in gardening and the cultivation of exotic flowers. The Dutch are the most flower-loving people in the world. In Holland, you can buy flowers on just about every street corner in the country, and flower bulbs even today remain a primary Dutch export commodity. But they're also very idealized, these paintings, because flower painters would make color sketches of fresh examples of each type of flower, and they would study scientifically accurate color illustrations in botanical publications. And then, using their sketches and their notebooks, they would compose bouquets of perfect specimens that, in fact, in nature would never all be found blooming at the same time. Now, the short life of blooming flowers, that's the vanitas element, the fact that everything is transient. And two of the most outstanding floral life painters would appear in the late 17th and in the 18th centuries, one of whom was Rachel Resch. Her father was a professor of botany and anatomy and an amateur artist, and her mother was the daughter of an architect. And in between 1708 and 1716, she was the court painter to the German Elector Palatine Johann Wilhelm at Dusseldorf. And somehow, she must have been quite an energetic woman. She managed to continue a career as an artist with rearing 10 children. She painted from the time she was a young woman until she was in her 80s. And she was very sought after for her sensitive, free-form arrangements and unusual and beautiful color harmonies. Her paintings brought in twice what Rembrandt's did. She invariably signed her paintings with her maiden name. And here you see that the bouquet of flowers forms a diagonal from the lower left to the upper right, and that's balanced by the diagonal of the tabletop. Then to further balance the painting, the highlighted blossoms and leaves are shown against the dark left half of the canvas, and then they're silhouetted against the light wall areas at the right. And she would often emphasize the beauty of the curving flower stems and would also put in little interesting additions because she had access to her father's collection of natural curiosities. So here you see in the lower left there is a moth. It's, whoops, back one. Oh, yes, right here. And there's some snail shells down below. And those both give the painting some interest. Also, a moth is a very short-lived creature, so again, it's a form of transience. And then in the following century, we have the work of Jan van Heesum. Van Heesum was taught by his father, who was also a flower painter, and he won even greater acclaim than Rachel Resch. Among his patrons were the kings of Poland and Prussia, the dukes of Orleans and Mecklenburg, and the Elector of Saxony. While he was still alive, collectors would pay as much as 1,000 guilders for his paintings. This particular example sold in 1771 for 3,000 guilders. And his flower pieces are often set on a stone plinth in a garden vase decorated with classical bas-reliefs. Frequently, he uses many cool colors with saturated blues and greens. In fact, some of his still lifes actually have double dates. He was very painstaking in his work. So he apparently insisted on doing details from nature, and he might have to wait an entire year before a needed blossom would actually come would come to fruit. He once wrote an agent of the Duke of Mecklenburg that he was unable to finish a painting for the Duke because he could not obtain a yellow rose, because otherwise he would have finished it the previous year. Floral still lifes would never lose their popularity in Holland. And in the 1880s, some of Van Gogh's most memorable masterpieces would be paintings of irises and sunflowers. And our last picture. Okay. And with that, I would like to say you've been a very great audience, and I thank you all for your very kind attention.